Captain Ahab is one of the most famous characters in literature. His self-destructive pursuit of Moby Dick, the great white whale, and his quest for revenge is a warning to humanity of the dangers of becoming obsessed with a single, all-consuming desire. But what kind of madness could drive a man to the destruction of his ship, his crew, and himself?
Welcome to Insane History. I'm Graeme Yorston, and today I'm exploring the dark and tragic tale of Captain Ahab, Herman Melville's most memorable creation, from my perspective as a psychiatrist. Let's start with his name, Ahab. We never know his full name, he's just Ahab.
But it is a name full of meaning. Ahab was one of the wicked kings of Israel. Corrupted by his wife, the infamous Jezebel, he abandoned his faith and allowed the worship of the false gods Baal and Asherah, and ruled his lands with a heavy hand. He is said to have been fabulously rich, building an ivory palace for each of his 70 sons. But on his death, his body was licked by dogs and pigs. Melville doesn't give us much by way of a backstory. We hear that both his parents died before Ahab was a year old. His father perhaps even before he was born, as his naming is described as a foolish, ignorant whim of his crazy, widowed mother. We learn he began his career as a harpooner and struck his first whale at the age of 18, and that he has since endured 40 years of privation and peril and storm time, 40 years of the pitiless sea. We know he has a wife and son, and that he was already past the age of 50 when he got married, and that he chose to leave for his next whaling expedition the day after his wedding, leaving but one dent in the marriage pillow, as Melville poetically puts it. This is an important clue to Ahab's pre-Moby Dick personality, that he would choose to leave behind his young bride of one day and return to the sea and dine upon mouldy crusts and dry salted fare rather than the landsman's fresh fruit, says a lot about what was important to Captain Ahab and what wasn't. And the love of a woman clearly wasn't high on his list of priorities. Interesting, as Melville himself wasn't long married and was just beginning to have some difficulties in his relationship with his wife. There are further tantalisingly brief mentions of key moments in Ahab's life. That thing that happened to him off Cape Horn long ago when he lay dead for 3 days and nights. We never know what that thing was. That deadly scrimmage with the Spaniard afore the altar in Santa. Santa where? And which Spaniard or Spaniards is he talking about? And the silver calabash he spat into. Was it a simple calabash or gourd, or was it a silver chalice in a church somewhere? These hints at life-threatening events and a rejection of religion are not expanded upon, but point intriguingly to the origins of the darkness in Ahab's soul. But one thing that is made clear is that it is the loss of his leg to the great white whale that finally drives him over the edge and into madness. The word Melville uses is monomania, a term first used by French psychiatrist Jean-Étienne Esquirol around 1810 to describe a set of patients with partial insanity, to separate them from the usual asylum dwellers, the raving, bestial madmen who were devoid of reason.
The monomaniac was seen as having a single pathological preoccupation in an otherwise sane mind, an idée fixe, or fixated idea.
In his influential textbook, Esquirol proposed several different subtypes of the condition, including erotomania or delusions of love, kleptomania or an irresistible urge to steal, pyromania, an urge to start fires, and several others. The concept was widely adopted in France and slightly later in Britain and America, but gradually fell out of favour with asylum doctors after Esquirol's death in 1840. By this time, however, the notion of the idée fixe had very much entered the world of literature. Playwright and opera librettist Eugène Scribe felt his audience was well enough acquainted with the term in 1832 to use it as the title of his comedy, Une Monomanie. Edgar Allan Poe's short story Berenice has a young man obsessing unhealthily about his beloved's teeth. And both Elizabeth Gaskell in Mary Barton and Wilkie Collins in Basil portray the destructive effects of monomania. The series of paintings of patients at two of Paris's hospitals for the insane by Théodore Géricault, who himself suffered from a major mental illness, illustrates some of the different varieties of monomania.
But whilst it fell out of use by psychiatrists, it remained very much in use by poets and novelists, including Herman Melville.
Captain Ahab is described as a monomaniac 4 times in Moby Dick, and educated readers would have been familiar with what he meant by this. And Ahab himself knows he is mad. He knows where his obsession is taking him. I'll chase him round Good Hope, and round the Horn, and round the Norway Maelstrom, and round perdition's flames before I give him up. Melville uses other words, lunacy, madness, and delirium, interchangeably for Ahab's obsession, but clearly describes the moment when it reaches its full depth. In the long months after he had lost his leg, Ahab and Anguish lay stretched together in one hammock. Then it was that his torn body and gashed soul bled into one another, and so interfusing made him mad. The Penny Cyclopedia of the Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge, published in 1838, has a 4.5-page entry on insanity, and mentions Esquirol's monomania, and we know a copy was available along with other books on mental illness in the New York Society Library, which Melville frequented when he was living in New York in the late 1840s. So this is where he probably refined his ideas for the character, having previously seen with his own eyes tyrannical captains and the corrupting effects of excessive power. And Ahab isn't the only character in the novel who is a little touched. Elijah, with his portentous warnings, Gabriel, a sailor above the ship Jeroboam, who warns the crew not to hunt Moby Dick, believing the whale to be the incarnation of the Shaker god. Pip, the young lad who leaps out of the whaleboat in terror twice, leaving him an idiot as far as the rest of the crew are concerned. The mysterious Zoroastrian Fedallah, who prophesies Ahab's death by hemp. And the alcoholic, eternally grieving blacksmith Perth.
In fact, few on the Pequod are safely behind the thin red line of sanity.
Whilst Captain Ahab is an entirely fictional character created by Melville, Moby Dick is at least partly inspired by a real albino sperm whale that was famous amongst American whalers in the early 19th century. Explorer and author J.N. Reynolds published an account of the whale in Mocha Dick, or the White Whale of the Pacific, in the Knickerbocker magazine in 1839. He recounts tales of at least 100 attempted harpoonings of the enormous whale, which Mocha Dick, named after Mocha Island, a notorious place of shipwrecks off the coast of Chile, not only survived, but triumphed over, causing the death of many men by his sinking of whaleboats with his tail, before finally meeting his end. Having enjoyed considerable success with his earlier, mostly autobiographical stories of his adventures in the Pacific Islands, Melville had had a run of poor sales with his subsequent books, and he had high hopes of Moby Dick, which he wrote and then extensively revised in 1850 and 51 in an exhilarated, almost frenzied state, spending hours at his desk, rarely pausing for food, and giving his wife Lizzie serious concerns about his health.
It was published in Britain as The Whale in October 1851, and a month later in the US with its title changed to Moby Dick.
In Britain, most reviews were positive, although the more conservative Athenaeum described it as an ill-compounded mixture of romance and matter of fact. Early American reviews were often written by people who had not actually read the book, and tended to echo the more negative British ones. but those who did read it found much to praise, although they expressed reservations about its irreverence and profane jesting, and the Boston Post called it a crazy sort of affair. Sadly, Melville never saw the more positive reviews, and almost all of his subsequent work, novels, short stories and poetry, was met by either faint praise or downright hostility. And for the rest of his life he was plagued by periods of agonizingly inflamed eyes, back pain, dark moods and disillusionment.
Captain Ahab is one of the most studied, analysed and discussed characters in literature.
Early commentators noted his Shakespearean tragic hero qualities and likened him to King Lear, or Samuel Taylor Coleridge's doomed ancient mariner with his albatross around his neck. Early film versions of the novel, though, knocked 20 years off Ahab's age and had him as a romantic lead played by heartthrob John Barrymore. There is even a happy ending. The 1956 version, directed by John Huston, was closer to the novel, but many felt that Gregory Peck was miscast and a bit too gentlemanly to be an authentic Ahab. Some have suggested that Ahab's relationship with the whale is a metaphor for an impossible, self-destructive love that Melville felt, either for his flirty married poetess neighbour, Sarah Morwood, or the shrouded in blackness Nathaniel Hawthorne. Others, that it is a warning that mankind should not attempt to dominate the elemental forces of nature. Another suggestion is that Ahab was on a voyage seeking cosmic certainty, who ends up discovering the tragic moral lesson that you reap what you have sowed.
There are all sorts of psychoanalytic interpretations of the metaphorical castration of Ahab, by the biting off of his leg by the teeth of Moby Dick.
But it is Ahab's destructive narcissism that has been commented on the most. Ahab is described as a grand, ungodly, godlike man. He has been successful on his many voyages and has great seamanship skills. He has enough charismatic charm to bring together the disparate transnational crew of the Pequod and get them functioning as one. But then, blinded by his rage at having been bested by the white whale, he cannot rest until he has destroyed his foe or been destroyed himself and taken the world with him. Ahab's ability to rally and lead and get people to do his bidding, as well as his disregard of the cost and consequences of his fanaticism, has been compared to that of Adolf Hitler and other dictators who have led their nations to destruction.
As a forensic psychiatrist, narcissistic rage is something I've seen many times in vengeful lovers who just cannot tolerate rejection. Someone always gets hurt, often very badly.
For me, Captain Ahab displays all the characteristics of narcissistic rage, stemming from a grandiose self-importance and an inability or unwillingness to care about anyone else. He allows his obsession with the whale to take over his whole existence, consuming everything, literally everything, in his pursuit of vengeance. Narcissists can be very dangerous. Hitler pretty much destroyed Europe. Ahab, only himself and the crew of the Pequod, save for Ishmael, who lived to tell his tale and warn us about the dangers of people who get obsessed and lose touch with reality.
Thank you for watching. This was just a short one about one of Herman Melville's key characters. But if you'd like to find out more about the author himself and the background to his writing of Moby Dick and his other works, then please check out my full-length video on his life. As always, I'd love to hear your views and any suggestions you may have for any other key characters by authors that I have covered in my videos. But apart from that, I'll say goodbye and I hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.